Have you ever wanted to make a statement jacket that looks straight out of a fantasy concert? Something that shimmers and moves and makes you feel unstoppable. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through how to make this golden jacket. From assembling the lining and the sleeves to creating those fun cross straps and adding all that trim to make this piece shine. Hi, I'm Christina, a digital pattern maker who loves bringing wearable art to life through digital pattern making that I can then wear and then share. If you'd like to sew along with me, you can grab this full pattern in the description below, along with some other of their coordinating pieces for this look. All right, let's go ahead and dive on in, grab our fabric, and create something magical. I'm going to be using a projector to project my pattern onto my fabric. The fabric I chose to make this jacket out of is a little bit lighter weight than I was hoping for when I bought it online. Therefore, I have decided to interface it with this fusible interfacing. The fabric that I bought is also a two-way stretch, so I wanted to make sure I had the interfacing to also be a two-way stretch. This is really important to me because I do want to make sure that the stretch of the fabric remains for the jacket in full, because in golden, people are dancing, you want to be able to move, so I wanted to make sure the jacket could stretch and breathe and flex with me. So I'm going to first calibrate my projector, then project my pattern, and I'm going to be tracing it straight onto the fusible interfacing. I'm doing this because then I'm going to fuse the interfacing to the fabric, matching up the grain lines, and then I'll cut them out together. That way I'm not trying to guess where the grain line is. I already have it marked by the edge of the fusible interfacing. I'm using some tracing paper from Richer the Thread so that I have a piece on the bottom and a piece on the top. I only have to trace out each piece one time and I get the opposing sides patterns in one go. I love using this paper. If you're interested, definitely check it out. They have it in lots of different colors. I have it in red, white, and blue, and I use it all the time. I am going to be fully lining this jacket, so I need to cut out all of my lining pieces as well as those facing pieces for the inside. I found this really great purple stretch fabric in my stock. Thanks past me for getting this who knows where, but it will be perfect for the lining. It is a little bit heavier than I was really ideally wanting, but it has the same rate of stretch and it's purple. It kind of matches her hair and her theme. So I really love that I have purple lining on the inside of my golden jacket. Once I have all the patterns traced out on my fusible interfacing, I'm going to lay out my main fabric. Now, my ironing table is not the biggest ironing table in the world. So because I wanted to iron this flat and iron all the patterns on as quickly and easily as possible, I turned my cutting table into an ironing table by removing my cutting mats and then putting up some towels all across my cutting table. I could then lay my fabric across and give it a good iron. It definitely needed a really good iron because it was shipped to me in a tiny vacuum packed bag and it was wrinkled galore. Now there is a little bit of velvet in this, so when I am ironing this, I am not pushing down super hard. Because I'm not using a velvet board, I don't want to crush my velvet or make it look unintentional. However, there's not so much velvet that I'm too worried about not having a velvet board to actually work with. Once I have all the wrinkles ironed out of my fabric, I am going to lay my interfacing pieces down with the grain line on the back of the fabric. This way I can make sure I'm nesting my pieces as close as possible, as well as making sure that they are all facing the same direction. I am working with velvet, so directionality of all of my patterns is essential. And whatever remnants I have at the end of this, I'm going to take a silver Sharpie and Sharpie an arrow pointing up so that I know if I ever, for whatever reason, need to recut something or redo something, I can easily know which way I had pointed up. Once they're all kind of pieced out and I know it's all going to fit, I'm going to start ironing my interfacing on. This takes a while. The interfacing is a slow to glue type of iron, and because I'm not putting a lot of pressure on it, it's going to take even a little bit longer. So it's at least 10 seconds per area, probably a little bit more, and I work from the center out and then just kind of doing once over all over each of these patterns. This part took me forever to do. I wish I had the fast forward button like I have when I'm watching videos like this so that I could have done it as fast as I could show it here. Whew, that is not even all the pieces that need to be ironed, but we're going to move on to cut out all of our pieces. Now that I have the interfacing all fused on, I am going to cut out each one of these pieces. Now, remember, below all of this fabric are fabric towels. If you ever decide to turn your cutting table into an ironing table, just remember, there is still fabric underneath that, so you want to be extra careful when you're cutting out pieces like this that you don't accidentally cut the towels that you are using as your ironing board. Now it's time to move over to the sewing machine and start creating this jacket. I'm going to start by pinning the cross straps together front to back. Then I'm going to move that aside and move on to pinning the sleeve top to bottom. And then finally move on to pinning the fronts and backs. I like to do batch pinning like this because I feel like I can move faster by doing a whole bunch of pinning and then move to my sewing machine and do a whole bunch of sewing and then move to the ironing board and do a whole bunch of ironing instead of pinning one seam, sewing it, and then ironing it. I just feel like it's a little bit quicker to do it in batches like this. Once I have everything pinned that I can, I'm going to move over to the sewing machine and start sewing these seams. I want to make sure that I'm backstitching at the beginning and the end of each one of these seams, and then I am also pulling my pins as I go. So right now I am sewing the side seam of my jacket, the shoulder seam of my jacket, the underarm seam of my sleeve, and both sides of the cross strap. Once I have the two halves of my jacket put together, I am going to then pin together that center back seam and sew it together. Now, the pattern I provided you did provide a center back seam. However, you do not need to have this center back seam there. You can take the 1/2 inch seam allowance out of the pattern and then cut that pattern on the fold and not have to do this center back seam. Whenever I am making costumes like this, I always like adding in a center back seam. That way, in the long run, if I ever need to take it out, take it in, I have an easy seam that I can do that on. And here we are sewing the long side of those cross straps. We're going to sew each side independently. And on this one, I started sewing on the wrong direction, so I'm having to pull my pins early. Be careful that you don't do the same. Before you move on to the next step, which is sewing in the sleeve, you are going to want to move over to your ironing board and press open all of your seams. Apparently, my video was not recording when I was doing my ironing this time, so I don't have me ironing this jacket open. However, that is an essential step to make sure that your garment looks nice and crisp and not puffy. So before you cross any other seam that's going to be sewn, such as your side seam and your underarm seam being sewn together, you want to make sure you give them a really good press. We are also going to want to put in 2 rows of basting stitches around the cap of the sleeve between the notches to help ease in that cap over the shoulder. There is not going to be a lot to ease in for this jacket because it is a fairly set in sleeve. However, there is a little bit of ease that is needed to get over that shoulder. So having these little gathering stitches is going to help immensely. Then once you have those, go ahead and line up the underarm seam, work your way up front to back, making sure that the back of the sleeve is matching up with the back piece. Once you get up to those notches, that is where you are going to start pulling in your threads to evenly gather the cap of the sleeve around the cap of the arm's eye. I used quite a few extra pins to make sure that everything was gathering easily and evenly. Once you have everything pinned, pull that sewing machine towards you and sew that seam together. And of course, once it's sewn, go back over to the ironing board and press it. And then repeat on the other side. Once you have your jacket made, it's time to make the lining. The first thing we're going to start on the lining is adding on those facings. Line up the top edges with the neckline and let them lay down. Then we're going to fold under that one raw edge. This is going to make sure that all of my raw edges are completely contained while also still giving a really nice facing so that if the jacket does roll out a little bit or it flashes open, it is still the same fabric as it is on the outside. We're going to do this with the center back pieces as well as the facing down the center front pieces. Here is the center front piece, and again, we're going to line up the cut edges with the front and center seam, and then we're going to fold under. Now, we do have this tricky area here where we're going to have to cut into the point. We're going to cut to and not through our stitch line. This way, we can more easily fold back the straight line down and the curved line up around the neckline. Once you've clipped in, go ahead and flip your fabric back over and do the exact same thing by turning the one edge under to contain all those raw edges. We're going to do this from the hem to the neckline on each of the front pieces. Once you have everything pinned in place, move back over to the sewing machine and top stitch those facings down on that one side. The other thing I like to do as well now is flatline the other parts of the facing to the lining. Since I did not cut the lining in half and I'm just adding fabric over the lining, I want to treat the top part of this where the facing is as one pattern piece. And the easiest way to do that to make sure it doesn't wudge on you or twist or do something funky is to sew them together so that they are married and act as one pattern piece. After the facings are attached, it's time to create the lining. We're going to do this in the same manner that we created the jacket. So I'm going to start by doing a whole bunch of pinning. I'm going to pin my shoulder seams, my side seams, my underarm seam, and then once I have batched pinned, I'm going to move over to my sewing machine and sew the shoulder seam, the side seam, the underarm seam, and then go back to batch pinning again. Again, this is just my favorite way to work. You can pin one seam and sew one seam and iron one seam and repeat until everything is done. Now we're back to pinning. This is my underarm seam that I'm pinning here. Once it's pinned, I'm going to sew it, then iron that seam open. Once I have my entire jacket put together, it's time to insert the sleeves. Again, you should put in 2 basting stitches in the seam allowance over the cap of the sleeve between the notches so that it can help you ease in the cap of the sleeve. The cap of the sleeve is not going to need much, but it's going to help make sure that you are easing it in where it needs to be eased in and it is sitting nicely over the shoulder cap. Once you have it ready, go ahead and start pinning at the underarm seam, working your way up the back and the front to the notches, ensuring that the back of the sleeve is matched up to the back pattern piece. Then over the cap of the sleeve, then go ahead and pull those basting stitches and ease the cap into the arm's eye. I definitely used quite a few pins to make sure everything was gathering evenly and the arm's eye would be easier to sew. Once the sleeve is set in, make sure to give it an iron, and then it's time to marry the lining to the fashion jacket. We're going to be doing this by bagging out the entire neckline and hem. If you have not tried on to make sure you're happy with the hem length, make sure to try on your jacket now before you do this step, because once you do this step, it will be harder to change the hem length of your jacket. Once you know you are happy with the hem length of your jacket, go ahead and line up all your seams, lining up center back to center back, shoulder seam to shoulder seam, all the way around. We're going to be doing a stitch that starts about 3.5 to 4 inches away from the bottom of the center back seam. And we're going to go all the way around the jacket, so around to the front, up the center front, around the neckline, back down the other center front, and then back around to about 4 inches from that center back seam. This 8 inches that we're leaving open is what we're going to flip the entire jacket right side out through. So you can go smaller, however, just know all of the fabric that is currently on the inside of this jacket will have to go through this hole. As I'm working around, I like to backstitch at every single corner. This makes sure that if I cut a little bit too close, there's a little bit extra sturdiness there. So I like to go up to the corner, backstitch, go up to right where the edge of the corner is, then turn the corner that I'm looking to, whether it's the 90 degrees at the bottom or the much wider turn up closer at the neckline. Then I will start sewing a little bit, backstitch to as close to the corner as I can without going over it, and then continue on my way. This is a really great way to do corners, and I always recommend, if you're doing corners, backstitch at them because it'll give you that much more security in the future. And here we are coming to the very end. Again, make sure you leave a wide enough opening that you can flip everything to the right side. Before I flip the jacket right side out, there is still some clipping I need to do. I want to do some clipping into my seam allowance around the curve of my neckline so that my neckline will lay better once it is flipped. I also want to clip my corners. This always makes it easier to get that fabric out of there so that you can have a nice crisp corner. I also provided a 2-inch hem in both the sleeve hem and the jacket hem of this jacket. I went with where my stitch line was marked for, and I now want to trim away that extra 2 inches. This will help with the bulkiness of the jacket. There won't be so much weight at the bottom of the hem of the jacket, and it will make the jacket look a little bit cleaner. So this is why I'm going to clip out my extra hem. I always recommend ironing this seam open as best you can. I love putting my tailor's point inside of my jacket through that 8-inch hole, and then I'm able to work my way around 90% of the seam, pressing that seam open. If you do this, it's going to make everything so much better. It's going to make it easier to flip, and it's going to make it look so much crisper. It does take time to do. However, it is well worth it in the end. And I'm sorry I don't have a video of this. Again, my video was not working at my ironing board for this project. Once you have everything ironed, that's when you're going to go ahead and flip everything to the right side. And as you're flipping to the right side, you're going to want to work specifically at those points. So where we just clipped away some of our fabric, we're going to want to make sure that it gets nice and pointed by using a point turner to really get that point pointed. This goes for the point right at the hemline, as well as the point that's intersecting the neckline and that center front line. One thing that I should have done before bagging out my jacket is sew on my 2 cross tabs. I should have done this so that all the raw edges were encased and I did not have to hand finish them. I forgot, but I highly recommend you don't. In my sewing instructions, I have that you should put on those cross straps before bagging out the neckline. Once all your points are pointed and you've gone around and ironed everything again, yes, go ahead and go iron all those seams again. We are then going to top stitch all the way around, starting at the center back, closing up the hole that we flipped everything through, going all the way around, so across the front hem, up the center front, around the neckline, down the other center front, and back around to the hem. This is going to top stitch it, make it nice and crisp, but it's also going to close up that center back hole. Once you have top stitched all the way around, we are now going to hem our sleeves. I'm going to do this with just a light cross stitch all the way around. We're going to take a small in-out stitch through the very hem of it, and then we're going to be doing another prick stitch through basically just the inner facing of that sleeve. This is called a cross stitch. Your sewing needle will always be pointed in the wrong direction as you are doing this cross stitch. It's a great way to do a blind hem so that you can't see where the hem is. We're going to work our way all the way around each one of the sleeves and hem them up at our desired length. Once we have hemmed the fashion fabric sleeve, then we are going to hem the lining sleeve. You want to hem the lining sleeve slightly shorter than the fashion sleeve. And as well as it being shorter, you still don't want it to be perfectly taut. You do want to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room with this lining sleeve being a little bit shorter. So I always like to pin it on, and then I will go around and do a quick slip stitch or cross stitch to marry the two seams while still having a little bit of my fashion fabric poking out at the end. It's really good to do it this way. If somebody looks up your sleeve or anything, they still are seeing that fashion fabric for a little bit before they start seeing the lining. Once your sleeves are hemmed, it is time to start decorating your jacket. There are so many different trims to choose from. Definitely go and find the ones that speak to you the most and start adding them on. The trims that I chose to put on, I could not easily put on with a sewing machine. So I'm having to hand sew all of my extra trims on after my entire garment is put together. However, you can choose to put on trims that could easily be put on with sewing machines. Put on the trims before you put the entire jacket together, and then you will not have all of this hand sewing that I had at the end. However, that's where we are, and we're about to do a whole bunch of hand sewing. The first thing I had to do was cut apart the jewels that I was going to use. I bought this wide trim that I could easily cut apart into the widths that I wanted so that I could have 2 single strands down my sleeve while still having a double row all the way around the neckline and the hem of my jacket. Once I have the trim cut out, I'm going to start placing it on my jacket. I'm going to start by pinning it on. That way it is on there and I'm not having to worry about sewing it and keeping it straight while I am sewing it. This can be a very tedious process, and sometimes it's like, why do I have to pin this on when I could just sew it? but adding that little bit of extra time, those little bit of extra steps is going to make it look much nicer. So I highly recommend pinning it on before then sewing it. And as I was sewing this, I found a really great way that I was kind of just whip stitching over all of the pieces except for around the curves. I whip stitched around the entire piece first. I then went back and whip stitch only around the bottom part of the trim. I had to do this because when I tried it on, the trim was flipping up a little bit and not laying flush. And I wanted to make sure that the trim laid flush and looked beautiful. So I had to go back and do a second stitch specifically around the curve of the neckline to give it a little bit more stability and a little bit more strength to leave it flat. Once I got my neckline all completed, I still had to do the hem of the jacket. I did this in a separate piece so that I'd have less bulk around that corner. And then I sewed it on in the same manner. So I first pinned it on where I wanted it to be, and then I whip stitched around all of it to make sure that it was set. Once I had the trim on my neckline and hem, I started working down the sleeves. Now, the sleeves is the one place I really wish I could have done with a sewing machine because it was such a pain in the butt to do it by hand. I tried very hard to get it straight, and there are parts that are still just a little bit curved, but it's on an arm. I'm not going to worry about it too much. Again, you have to think, how long do you want to spend doing this versus how long are you going to be wearing the costume? I again tried to pin it to make sure that it was pinned in that really straight line. I also could have chalked a line, something that will easily just flick off once you're done. That also would have really helped make sure that I was going in a straight line. However, if you choose different trim than I can, and you can sew your trim on, sewing that trim on your sleeve will give you such better results, and you will be so much happier because you won't be sewing 2 strips of trim onto your sleeve. Once the trim is on, it's time to add some closures. I'm going to first sew on 2 snaps onto the facing of the lining of the jacket. One really close up to the neckline and one about 3 inches down. This is going to be the closure for the cross neck snaps. Once you have those sewn on, it's time to put on your jacket, place those cross snaps, see where they're going to want to lay. I did give you 2 extra inches on either side of these cross straps so that you could make sure that you had plenty of extra room to make sure these cross straps could lay exactly where you want them. Once you know where you want them, make sure you pin the cross in the middle because we're going to want to stitch that together so that it doesn't move on you. And then also pin where your snaps are going to live on those cross straps. Once you have those, take your jacket off and start sewing on the other half of the snap onto the cross straps. Once you have the snaps on, make sure you go ahead and tack the center cross and maybe add some fun button or other sparkly dangle right there. Now it's time to move on to the shoulder embroidery. If you're interested in learning how to make this shoulder embroidery piece yourself without an embroidery machine, you can check out the video up here. The pattern is included with the jacket. I'm first going to place the embroidery piece on my shoulder while it is on a form so that I know that it is sitting right and it is laying the way I want. Then I'm going to pin it on. And then I'm going to hand stitch all the way around the embroidery piece, fully tacking it to my jacket. The next piece I need to make is the shoulder armor. Again, if you're interested in making this shoulder armor, you can see this video up here and make one for yourself. Once it's made, I decide to add mine on with snaps because there are times when she has it on and times when she doesn't have it on. So I wanted the ability to take off the shoulder armor. So I'm going to sew some snaps on the corners of the shoulder armor, and I'm going to sew some snaps onto my jacket that line up. I did use silver whopper poppers for the golden underpart, and I used black whopper poppers for on the jacket so that when I took it off, the black whopper poppers would still blend in a little bit more. The next thing I needed to make was the gold trim with V's. I bought some 1-inch wide gold trim, and then I 3D printed some V's to put on top of it to match. While the V's were 3D printing, I measured and created this harness looking thing that would go in front of my arms and cross over my back. Next, I laid out where the V's would want to lay and then started gluing them on. I used E6000 to glue on each one of the V's, and I worked all the way around the harness. Once I had all of the V's put on, I let it sit there to dry for at least 24 hours so that the glue didn't accidentally smudge onto my costume and all the V's would be fixed to the trim. While the harness piece was drying, I decided to sew on the chain. There is lots and lots of chain on Rumi for this golden look. I recommend getting 2 spools of the chain. I definitely went through more than one. And then it's all about looking at the picture and placing the chain as best you can. Or go freestyle and put the chain wherever you want. I would tack at certain points for the chain to help make sure that the chain stayed exactly where I wanted it to. Then finally, once my harness was dried, I slipped it on my jacket and then I did some thread belt loops around to hold it in place. A thread belt loop is a really handy stitch to know. It is also known as a swing tack. A thread belt loop is done by kind of crocheting your thread into a strip so that it has a little bit more density and a little bit more thickness to really help hold everything in. Once I knew I had the right width, I then stitched it to the other side, creating this nice little belt loop holding my harness on exactly where I want it to. I put some on the center front and underneath my arms, as well as on the center back. And I am so excited how this girl turned out. Check out the embroidery that I did, all the chains surrounding it, and the armor piece on the other arm. I absolutely love how it turned out. And the full outfit itself also looks amazing. Ooh, I'm so excited. And that's it. Your golden jacket is ready to steal the show. So whether you're performing for a cosplay or adding a little sparkle to your day or making your next Halloween project, this piece is pure magic. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. That way you can see other fun sew-alongs as well as some digital pattern drafting, some sewing tips, and of course those sewing tools. Now, go ahead and put on your new jacket and start singing your heart out to turn everything golden. I look forward to seeing you in some of my other videos. Happy sewing!